The silent king had ruled for 23 years without hearing a single voice. He was not deaf in the physical sense. His ears worked perfectly. He could hear the rustle of wind through palace corridors, the clatter of guards' boots on stone floors. Not a single word spoken by another person had reached his ears since the day he took the throne. It was not a curse exactly. It was a condition of the crown he wore, an ancient magic that separated the king from all human speech. The reasoning, according to the oldest texts, was that a ruler needed to see truth rather than hear lies, needed to judge actions rather than be swayed by eloquent words. For 23 years, King Theron had lived in this silence. He communicated through writing, through gestures, through elaborate systems of signs that his advisors had learned. They wrote their counsel on parchment, and he wrote his decisions in return. And for 23 years it had worked. Theron was considered a wise ruler, fair and just, someone who judged based on evidence rather than rhetoric. The kingdom prospered under his silent rule, and most people had forgotten there was any other way for a king to govern. But Theron himself had not forgotten. His father, the previous king, lying on his deathbed, had said, "Rule with wisdom, my son." Not then, but over 23 years of silence, that he was making decisions based on incomplete information, no matter how carefully he studied written reports. The woman who would change everything arrived at the palace on a day that seemed unremarkable. Her name was Kira, and she was mute. She had been born without the ability to speak, had lived her entire 27 years in a silence that was the inverse of the king's. But she could not add her own voice to that symphony. She had learned to communicate through signs, through written words, through the expressive language of gesture and expression that those who could not speak developed. She came to the palace seeking employment, and the royal court needed someone who could work with foreign dignitaries. She never met the king. She had no reason to. Translators worked for the council, not directly for the throne. But then a foreign delegation arrived, representatives from a kingdom that communicated primarily through sign language. Their entire culture was built around it, and they considered spoken language crude and imprecise. They needed someone who could serve as intermediary, someone who understood both sign language and the elaborate written protocols the silent king used. The council realized they had exactly one person who could fill that role. They brought Kira before the king. The meeting was supposed to be brief, a simple introduction so the foreign delegates could meet their translator. Kira approached the throne, bowed properly, and looked up at the king. And the moment their eyes met, something happened that no one had anticipated, that no ancient text had prepared them for. The bond awakened. It was not loud. It was not even sound in the traditional sense. That existed in a space where words were unnecessary. He felt her presence in his mind, not as thoughts or language, but as pure understanding, as emotion and intent and meaning that flowed directly from her consciousness to his. And for the first time in 23 years, he understood another person completely. He understood her in a way that transcended language, in a way he had never understood anyone. Kira felt it too. She felt the king's presence in her mind, his weariness, his sense of isolation, his deep commitment to serving the kingdom, despite the loneliness of his silence. She felt his kindness, his wisdom, his quiet strength, as though they had been searching for each other without knowing it, as though this meeting was inevitable. The advisors were speaking urgently. He could see, alarmed by whatever had just happened. Their hands moving in patterns Kira would normally have translated but could not because she was still locked in this overwhelming connection with the king. Theron stood, descended from the throne, and approached Kira. He should not have done this. Protocol demanded that subjects approach the throne, not the other way around. But protocol seemed irrelevant in the face of what was happening. She understood him, even though no words had been spoken, and she answered in the same wordless way, the response flowing through the connection. "I do not know, but I feel you. I understand you. This is not speech, but something deeper. Something important is happening, and I need to understand it." The advisors hesitated, but eventually withdrew, taking the confused foreign delegates with them. Theron and Kira were left alone in the throne room, connected by this invisible bond that neither understood, but both felt was profoundly significant. Theron gestured toward a side chamber, and Kira followed. Kira took the tablet and wrote her response. "I felt you in my mind, not words, not thoughts, but ... you. Your emotions, your intentions, your essence. I have never experienced anything like it. Neither have I. In 23 years of silence, I have never felt connection like this. The legends speak of it, a connection between certain souls, a way of understanding that transcends normal communication. But I always thought it was metaphor, not literal truth." Theron wrote, "The old texts mention the bond, but they say it is rare, that most people never experience it, that when it forms it is unmistakable and profound. I think this is what they meant. We are bonded somehow, connected in a way that bypasses the limitations that keep us isolated from others." She simply opened herself to the bond and let Theron feel what she meant. He did not write lengthy explanations. He let Kira experience it directly through their connection. It was intimate in a way that was both exhilarating and frightening. Everything was clear, direct, complete. As the sun set and servants came to light the chamber's lamps, Theron wrote, "This changes everything. Emotions, intentions, the subtle truths that exist beneath words. What are you suggesting?" Kira wrote back, "I am suggesting that you stay, that we explore this bond, understand what it allows us to do. I have no training in governance, no knowledge of statcraft. The ability to bridge the gap between my silence and the world of sound I cannot access. Through you, through this bond, I might finally hear what my people truly need." Kira was quiet for a long moment, and through the bond Theron felt her uncertainty, her fear that she was not adequate for what he was proposing, her concern that she would fail him. "I will try," she wrote finally, "but I do not know if I can do what you ask. I do not know if the bond is strong enough or if I am wise enough. We will learn together," Theron wrote, and through the bond she felt his confidence, his certainty that this was right, and it steadied her. The next morning Theron announced to his council that Kira would be appointed as his personal advisor. She was a translator, they protested, not a counselor. She had no experience in governance, no understanding of policy, no qualification for such a position. Theron wrote his response carefully. "She has a qualification none of you possess. She can help me understand things that your written reports cannot convey. Through her, I can access information that has been denied to me for 23 years. Trust me in this." The council had no choice but to accept his decision. though their confusion and concern were obvious. Some suspected the king had developed an inappropriate attachment to this woman. Others worried that he was making decisions based on something they did not understand. He could sense when someone was lying, when someone was uncertain. He discovered that one of his most trusted advisors, whose written counsel was always impeccable, was deeply corrupt and had been enriching himself at the kingdom's expense. He discovered that another advisor, whose recommendations he had often dismissed as too cautious, not because Kira told him what to do, she did not have that knowledge. They did not understand how this was happening, but they could not deny the results. Beyond the council, Theron began using the bond to understand his people more broadly. Kira would walk through the city, observe and listen, and then return to share what she had experienced. It was not the same as hearing voices directly. The bond filtered everything through Kira's perspective, through her understanding. But it was closer than anything he had experienced in 23 years. Through her, he began to feel connected to his kingdom in a way the crown's magic had prevented, to make decisions that served the people rather than just maintaining order. And as they worked, they learned more about each other, shared more of themselves, became more intimately connected than either had thought possible. Kira told him through the bond about her childhood, about developing her gift for languages as a way to feel closer to the sounds she could hear but not produce. Theron shared his own story about becoming king at 21, about the moment the crown's magic took his hearing, about making decisions that affected millions while being cut off from the very people he served, about wondering if he was truly fit to rule when he was missing such a fundamental part of human experience. Through these exchanges, they developed something beyond friendship, beyond professional partnership. They became essential to each other. Theron found in Kira someone who could bridge his silence, who could help him connect with the world he had been separated from, who made him feel less alone than he had felt in decades. The court began to notice the relationship between the king and his advisor. Others saw it as beautiful, as proof that even a silent king could find connection. The speculation intensified when it became clear that Theron and Kira spent almost all their time together. Your relationship with the translator has become the subject of much speculation. Some say you have become too dependent on her, that you are making decisions based on her influence rather than on rational analysis. Others say that the relationship is improper, that it compromises your position. We believe you must either define the relationship clearly or end it. He wrote his response slowly, carefully. Kira is not just my advisor. But even as he wrote it, he knew it was not entirely true. The connection was not romantic in the conventional sense. They had not touched beyond formal greetings. They understood each other completely, cared for each other deeply, were bound together in ways that transcended normal relationships. Was that love? Theron did not know. He had no experience with it, had been isolated in his silence too long to understand what love meant. But he knew that losing Kira would be devastating, that she had become essential, not just to his rule, but to his existence. Kira felt the same, but what she felt for Theron was so deep, so all-encompassing, that no other word seemed adequate. The crisis came 6 months after the bond had formed, when foreign enemies attempted an invasion of the kingdom's northern border. The attack was coordinated and clever, his dependence on written communication that was slower than speech. But they had not accounted for the bond. Through Kira's eyes and emotions, Theron understood the situation instantly and completely. Instead, they faced a defense that responded as though the king himself were present on the battlefield. The invasion failed, the enemy retreated, and the kingdom's borders remained secure. Word of what had happened spread throughout the court and the kingdom. The silent king had responded to an invasion in real time, had coordinated the defense with impossible speed. Speculation about the king and his translator intensified. How had she communicated the threat to him instantly? What power did they share? Theron decided to make the truth public. Linking of souls that allows communication beyond speech or writing. Through this bond, I have become a more effective king, able to understand my people and respond to their needs with greater wisdom. Some celebrated it as a miracle, as proof that even the most profound isolation could be bridged. The silent king, who had once been pitied for his isolation, was now considered one of the wisest rulers in the kingdom's history. As years passed, the bond between them grew even stronger. They developed abilities that shocked even themselves. Kira could sometimes know what Theron wanted without him writing it. Theron could feel Kyra's experiences so vividly that it was almost as though he was living through them, could understand complex situations through her perceptions. Kira was seated at a separate table, too far away for any conventional communication, yet he felt through the bond that something was wrong. One of the foreign nobles was lying, his pleasant written words concealing hostile intent. But through Kira, who could hear the subtle tension in the man's voice, who could sense the dissonance between his words and tone, Theron understood the truth. He quietly had the man investigated, and they discovered he was plotting to poison the wine supply. The plot was thwarted before it could be enacted, and the foreign delegation was sent home in disgrace. Word of the incident spread, and people began to whisper that the silent king somehow knew things he should not be able to know, that his inability to hear voices had not made him weak, but had somehow made him more perceptive. They were not wrong. The bond gave Theron access to layers of understanding that hearing alone would never have provided. Kira did not just relay what people said, she conveyed how they said it, what emotions drove their words, what intentions lurked beneath their rhetoric. They could share experiences across distance. When Kira traveled to distant provinces, Theron could feel what she felt, see what she saw, understand the kingdom through her direct observations, offering comfort without words, letting him know he was not alone. They developed a language entirely their own, built not on signs or writing, but on pure emotional and intentional exchange. A feeling could convey what would take a paragraph to write. An emotion could communicate nuance that words always flatten. Theron showing Kira the moment the crown's magic had taken his hearing. They understood each other's pain, joys, fears, and hopes with a completeness that was almost overwhelming. The intimacy of this connection created complications. Theron found himself thinking about Kira constantly. He would catch himself seeking her presence, not because he needed her counsel, but because being near her, feeling their bond pulse between them, made him feel whole in a way he had not felt since before taking the crown. Kira experienced the same pull. Through the bond, she could express herself more fully than she ever had through signs or writing. Theron understood her not just intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually. Was this love, friendship, something entirely new that had no established category? They spent hours together every day, knew each other's thoughts and feelings intimately, cared for each other deeply, but they had not touched beyond formal greetings, had not spoken words of affection because Theron could not hear and Kira could not speak, had not engaged in any of the conventional rituals of courtship. The court watched their relationship with fascination and concern. Some saw beauty in it, two people profoundly isolated finding connection with each other, whose influence over him was undeniable and possibly dangerous, as a connection that was too intimate to be proper, but too unusual to be condemned through normal social rules. The pressure to define their relationship intensified when Theron's advisors suggested he should marry to produce an heir. Theron read each proposal carefully and rejected them all. Through the bond, Kira felt his revulsion at the idea of marrying someone he could not communicate with. But Kira also felt something else, his unspoken wish that he could marry her. In the conventional sense, she was not sure. Marriage meant physical intimacy, shared living space, children, all the traditional markers of partnership. She and Theron already had intimacy far beyond what most married couples ever achieved, but it was emotional and mental rather than physical. She was mute, common-born, trained as a translator rather than in statecraft. The kingdom already struggled to accept her influence over the king. Would they accept her as queen? Would the nobles who barely tolerated her presence rebel against her elevation? But even as she listed these concerns, she felt through the bond that Theron was thinking similar thoughts, wrestling with the same questions. And she felt something else, his certainty that what they had was more valuable than any conventional relationship, that the bond was worth protecting, even if it meant remaining unmarried. The first private written communication they had exchanged in months, they usually relied on the bond for personal matters. In it she wrote, "I feel your conflict about marriage, about how to preserve what we have while satisfying the kingdom's expectations. I want you to know that I am content with what we have. Our bond gives me more connection than any conventional marriage could. If you must marry for political reasons, if the kingdom demands an heir, I will understand. Our connection will remain regardless. But if you are asking whether I want to be your wife in the formal sense, yes." Theron read her letter, and through the bond, Kira felt his emotions surge: relief, joy, certainty, fear, hope, not for political reasons or because the council demands it, but because our bond deserves recognition, because what we have should be honored, because I want the kingdom to understand that you are essential not just to my rule, but to my existence. But I will not ask this of you unless you are certain. Are you prepared for that?" Through the bond, she showed him her answer, not in words but in feeling, in certainty that this was right regardless of the difficulties it would bring. Yes, the announcement of their engagement created exactly the turmoil Theron had anticipated. Half the council resigned in protest, claiming that a king could not marry a mute commoner, that the kingdom needed a queen who could fulfill traditional duties, that this union was improper and possibly invalid. Several noble houses broke off diplomatic relations, offended that their daughters had been rejected in favor of a translator. There were protests in the capital, with some celebrating the unusual romance and others condemning it as a violation of tradition. But Theron stood firm. He wrote a proclamation explaining his decision. "Kira is not just my advisor. Through the bond we share, she has made me a better king than I ever could have been alone. She will be queen, not because of noble birth, but because of her service, her wisdom, and her essential role in governance. Those who cannot accept this may serve elsewhere. Instead, they stood together before the court, and a scribe read vows that both had written, describing their commitment not just to each other, but to the kingdom they served together. The most powerful moment came when they exchanged rings. The bond between them flared so strongly that several people in the front rows claimed they felt it, a pulse of pure connection that seemed to fill the chamber. And when Kira placed the ring on Theron's finger, tears streaming down her face, the same pulse occurred, and people understood that what they were witnessing was not just a political marriage, but something profound and real. They ruled together for the next 15 years, and they were among the most prosperous years in the kingdom's history. Together they reformed the kingdom's laws to be more just. Through the bond, Theron could understand how laws affected ordinary people, could sense when rules that seemed fair in writing created hardship in practice, could make adjustments that previous kings would never have known were needed. Laws about debt were reformed to prevent exploitation. Laws about justice were made more equitable, with punishments scaled to actual harm rather than to the status of victims. Together, they strengthened the kingdom's economy by understanding trade in ways that went beyond written reports. And share what she learned through the bond. Theron could then make decisions based on real needs, rather than on what advisors claimed were needs. Trade flourished, new industries developed, and prosperity spread more evenly across social classes, and expanded access to education for poor children who previously had been excluded. The kingdom transformed under their partnership. Kira began to age faster than she should have. At first it was subtle, a few gray hairs appearing earlier than expected, fine lines forming around her eyes when she was only in her early 30s, but the aging accelerated. By 35 she looked 45. By 40 she looked 60, her hands gnarled and trembling. Through the bond, Theron felt what was happening. The connection was consuming her life force, burning through her vitality like a candle flame consuming wax. Every time she opened herself to him, every time she channeled the kingdom's voices to him, and over years those pieces accumulated into a cost that could not be sustained. He begged her to stop, to limit their use of the bond, to let him return to ruling in silence rather than watch her waste away. But Kira refused. Through the bond, she showed him what their connection meant to her, that it had given her life purpose and meaning she had never imagined possible, that serving as his bridge to the world was worth whatever price it demanded, that she would rather burn brightly and briefly than return to the isolation she had known before. "I was mute and invisible," she wrote to him one night when words seemed necessary despite the bond. "I existed but did not matter. No one saw me truly, no one understood me, no one needed what I uniquely could offer. My inability to speak became the very thing that made our bond possible. My isolation became the mirror of yours, and together we found connection that neither of us could have found alone. This has been worth everything. Do not ask me to give it up just to live a few more years of isolation." Theron understood through the bond that she meant every word, but understanding did not make it easier to watch her deteriorate, to feel through their connection how much effort it took for her to simply exist, how exhausted she was all the time, how her body was failing, even as her mind remained sharp. The court watched this deterioration too, and reactions varied. Some pitied her, saw her sacrifice as noble and tragic. Others saw it as proof that the bond was dangerous, that it demanded too much, that unnatural connections carried unnatural costs, that he was selfishly draining her life to maintain his own power, that he should release her from whatever magic bound them together. But those close to them, Theron was not consuming Kira. The bond itself was consuming both of them. But Kira bore more of the cost because she was the one who channeled, who translated, who served as conduit between his silence and the world's sound. And she chose this willingly, repeatedly, despite his pleas that she stop. The exhaustion was too profound, the weight of the bond too heavy. But she still served, still opened herself to Theron through their connection, still helped him understand the kingdom. Even as she was dying, she insisted on fulfilling her purpose, feeling through the bond what she was too tired to write. They communicated less through intentional sharing, now and more through simple presence, through the comfort of knowing the other was there. One night, as Kira was falling asleep, she opened herself fully to the bond one last time, and she showed Theron everything she had never quite expressed, how much she loved him, how grateful she was that he had seen her when others had looked past her. She showed him that she was not afraid of dying, because death meant nothing compared to what she had lived, that she was proud of what they had built together. The sudden absence was like losing a limb, like having part of his soul torn away. For the first time in 24 years, he was truly alone again, cut off not just from spoken voices, but from the one connection that had made his silence bearable, from the person who had understood him completely. He did not cry. The shock was too profound for tears. The silence that had once been merely an absence became a void that threatened to swallow him whole. Theron watched this deterioration with growing anguish, had made her isolation meaningful, had allowed her to contribute to something larger than herself. She would rather burn brightly and briefly than return to the loneliness she had known before. When Kira died at 47, Theron felt it through. The bond felt her consciousness fading, felt their connection stretching and finally breaking, cut off not just from spoken voices, but from the one connection that had made his silence bearable. He still performed his duties, still wrote his decisions, still governed with the wisdom that had characterized his rule. But something essential was missing. Those who had known him during the years with Kira saw the difference immediately. He made decisions more slowly now, questioned himself more, seemed uncertain in ways he never had when she was alive. His advisors tried to help. They suggested he find another advisor, someone else who might serve as intermediary, someone who could help bridge his silence. They even brought several candidates, people who were skilled communicators, who seemed empathetic and intelligent, who might be able to fill some small part of the role Kira had played. Theron met with each candidate politely and dismissed them all, that the bond was not something he could simply form with another person, that she had been unique and irreplaceable. He thanked them for their willingness to serve, but made clear that he would not be seeking a replacement. In truth, he tried to form new bonds. Late at night, alone in his chambers, he would focus his mind and reach out the way he and Kira had reached toward each other that first day, who might be able to connect with him across the silence that separated him from the world. But he felt nothing. Whatever had made the bond with Kira possible was either unique to her or had been exhausted through their connection. He was alone, and he would remain alone. The isolation affected his governance. Without Kira to help him understand the emotional truths beneath written reports, he began making mistakes. Would have warned him before the appointment was made. He approved a trade agreement that looked favorable in writing, but disadvantaged the kingdom's craftspeople. Kira would have felt their distress and communicated it to him before the agreement was signed. These were not catastrophic errors. The kingdom did not collapse. Each mistake reminded him of what he had lost, of how much he had depended on her. He began spending more time at Kira's tomb. It was located in the palace gardens, a simple stone structure that bore only her name and dates. She had requested simplicity, had said through the bond in her final days that elaborate memorials were pointless, that what mattered was the work they had done together and the kingdom they had served. Theron would sit beside the tomb for hours, remembering their conversations through the bond, reliving the moments when they had understood each other completely, mourning not just her death, but the death of the connection that had defined both their lives. It was during one of these vigils that he made his decision. He was 50 years old, had ruled for 30 years, and he was tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. The isolation was crushing him. The silence had become unbearable, and he could not imagine continuing for another decade or more without Kira, without the bond, without the one person who had truly known him. He wrote his abdication decree carefully, explaining that he could no longer serve the kingdom as it deserved, that his isolation prevented him from governing with the wisdom necessary, that a new ruler should be chosen who could hear their advisers and people directly. He named his nephew as his successor, a young man of 25 who had been trained in governance, and who did not carry the crown's curse of silence, because that magic manifested differently in each generation. But Theron was resolute. Through written responses he made clear that his decision was final, that he had given the kingdom 30 years and had nothing left to give, that he wanted to spend whatever time remained to him in peace rather than in the grinding loneliness of the throne. The abdication ceremony was somber. Theron removed the crown and placed it on his nephew's head, watching as the younger man experienced the moment when the crown's magic took his hearing. He saw the shock and disorientation on his nephew's face, saw the sudden silence descend, and he felt a pang of guilt. He had passed on this burden, this isolation, this curse disguised as duty. But his nephew had been prepared. He had learned to write clearly, had practiced communicating through gestures and signs, had studied Theron's methods of governance. And unlike Theron, he would never know what it was like to hear voices and then lose them. He was entering silence from the beginning, which was perhaps easier than entering it after decades of hearing. Theron retired to a small estate on the edge of the kingdom, far from the capital and its politics, and he requested that he be left alone to live out his remaining days in quiet contemplation. The court honored this request, though they made sure he had everything he needed, though they checked periodically to ensure he was well. He spent his days in the estate's library, reading the books he had never had time for when he was king. He walked in the gardens, tended to plants, watched the seasons change with an attention he had never been able to give them before. And he wrote long letters that were never sent, memoirs that recorded his years with Kira, reflections on governance and isolation and the nature of connection. In these writings he tried to make sense of what he and Kira had shared. He concluded that the bond was not meant to last as long as theirs had, that it was intended for brief moments of profound connection rather than for decades of constant use, that they had pushed it beyond its natural limits because neither could bear to return to isolation. He wrote about the cost of the bond, about how Kira had essentially given her life to maintain their connection, about whether he should have forced her to stop, even though she insisted she wanted to continue. He never reached a conclusion he was satisfied with. Either choice seemed wrong. Forcing her to stop would have stolen her purpose and joy. Allowing her to continue had killed her. There was no good answer, only the reality of what had happened. He wrote about isolation, about what it meant to be separated from other humans by barriers that could not be crossed. He wrote about the silence that surrounded him, about how it felt to see people's mouths move and know they were speaking but to hear nothing, about the loneliness of never being able to have a spontaneous conversation, about always having to plan every communication, always having to translate thoughts into written words before they could be shared. And he wrote about love, the strange, profound love he had shared with Kara. Was it love? He still did not know. It had not looked like love as most people understood it. They had not courted, had not engaged in romance as traditionally defined, but they had known each other more intimately than most couples ever did, had shared consciousness in ways that went beyond anything physical, had been essential to each other's existence. Perhaps that was love in its purest form, to be truly known by another person, to know them in return, to be necessary to each other not out of dependence but out of genuine connection. If so, then he had loved Kira, and she had loved him, and their love had been deeper than voices or words could ever express. He died quietly in his sleep 3 years after abdicating, at the age of 53. The servants found him in the morning, peaceful, a half-written letter on the desk beside his bed. The letter was addressed to Kira, as many of his writings had been, and it read simply, "I am coming to find you. Perhaps where we are going, the bond will not require words or sacrifice. Perhaps we will finally be able to speak to each other, you with the voice you never had in life, me with the hearing I lost to the crown. Or perhaps we will discover that speech was never necessary, that what we had was always complete. Either way, I will find you. Wait for me." What they had sacrificed, what they had given to the throne, they were buried side by side as Theron had requested, and the inscription on their joined monument was changed to include his words. Two souls bound beyond words, who proved that silence could speak louder than any voice. The new king, Theron's nephew, ruled well, but never formed a bond like the one his uncle had shared. The crown's magic had taken his hearing as it had taken Theron's, but whatever had made Theron and Kira compatible did not exist for him. He learned to govern through writing and observation, as previous silent kings had done, and he did so competently. But he lacked the deep understanding that had characterized Theron's rule, the ability to sense truth beneath words, to understand people's intentions and emotions with perfect clarity. Scholars studied the records of Theron and Kira's reign, trying to understand what they had achieved and how. They found documentation of the bond, descriptions of how it worked, accounts of what it allowed them to do, records of decisions made with wisdom that seemed impossible given the king's isolation. But they could not replicate it. The bond, it seemed, was not something that could be taught or learned. It either formed or it did not, and when it formed it was unique to the individuals involved. The story of the silent king and the mute advisor spread far beyond the kingdom's borders. It became legendary, a tale told to illustrate profound truths about communication. Different cultures interpreted it differently. Some saw it as a romance, some as a tragedy, some as a demonstration of sacrifice and service. But all agreed it represented something profound about the human need to be understood, to connect across the barriers that separate us, to find someone who truly knows us. The legend took on particular meaning for those who struggled with communication, the deaf, the mute, those with speech impediments or social anxieties, anyone who had ever felt isolated by their inability to express themselves or to understand others. The story showed that connection could take forms beyond what was expected, that limitations could be transformed into strengths, that sometimes the deepest understanding came not from speaking or hearing, but from a willingness to truly see another person. And though the bond was rare, though most people never experienced it, the story gave hope. It showed that isolation was not permanent, that barriers could be crossed, that two people who seemed fundamentally unable to communicate might find a way to understand each other perfectly. It showed that connection was not about having the same capabilities or experiences, but about being willing to meet each other in the space between, to build bridges across the silence that separated them. The throne had stood for centuries, untouched by any voice. Kings had come and gone, isolated by the crown's magic, all making decisions in profound silence. But Theron had been the first to truly hear, not through ears, but through something deeper, something that transcended all physical senses. And Kira, who had never spoken a single word, had been the voice that finally shook the throne, not with sound, but with pure understanding, not with speech, but with a connection that proved words had always been optional. No voice had ever shaken the throne, until the bond spoke without words, and in that wordless communication, in that pure understanding between two profoundly isolated souls, something eternal was revealed. That true connection required not voices, but vulnerability, not speech, but the courage to be fully known, not words, but the willingness to reach across the silence that separates us all and say, without saying anything at all, I see you. I understand you. You are not alone. This has been a story of silence and connection, of isolation transformed and understanding found in unexpected places. If this tale moved you, if you recognized the loneliness of being unable to communicate or the joy of finally being understood, I invite you to share your thoughts below. What does it mean to truly hear someone? Can connection exist without words? How do we bridge the isolation that separates us from each other? Your reflections give these stories meaning, and I would be honored to hear them. If you enjoyed this journey into the world of the silent bond, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you may return when the next story is told, when another bond forms, and when silence, perhaps, speaks once more.